All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Kim Wagner, and today we're going to be talking about common aerospace pitfalls and reviewing commonly misunderstood AS 9100, 9110, and 9120 requirements. So just to introduce myself a little bit further, like I said, my name is Kim Wagner. I'm the Aerospace Program Manager here at Perry Johnson Registrars. I'm a certified aerospace auditor for AS 9100, 9110, and 9120, and I've been with PJR for about 10 years now. I've listed my email address here in case you want to take note of it. You can always reach out to me with any questions you may have, whether it's on anything we discussed today or anything else related to aerospace certification. Now, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type those into the provided box, and I'll try to get to those, or we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to go ahead and type those questions as they pop up for you. Okay, so quick overview here. There are a few requirements within the 9100, 9110, and 9120 standards that some organizations seem to struggle with. We see a few repeated themes here. So whether you're new to the aerospace standards or you've been maintaining a certified aerospace quality management system for a while now, we thought that an in-depth review of some of these requirements and the misconceptions surrounding them would be helpful. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about the following topics: value-added process measures, supplier performance monitoring, and organizational risk versus operational risk, control of non-conforming outputs process requirements, and the corrective action process requirements. So we're going to start with our value-added process measures. Now, for each of these topics, I want to start from the source, right? I want to start where these requirements are in the standards and give some context to where these requirements are coming from. So our first one here is about value-added process measures in the AS 9100, 9120, and 9110 standards. This requirement stems from 441, and we're going to be focusing on subclauses C and G. So as it says here, the organizations shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve a quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this standard. So it says that once you have to determine the processes needed for a QMS and their application throughout the organization, and you shall, C, determine and apply the criteria and methods, including monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators needed to ensure the effective operation and control of these processes. And we're going to jump to G, evaluate these processes and implement any changes needed to ensure that these processes achieve their intended results. So to summarize, the standard requires that you determine the processes of your QMS, right? And so we've got kind of an example interaction of processes here, kind of a basic one based on common processes for an AQMS. We've got our management support process, our contract review process, purchasing and manufacturing as our three operational processes. So once we've determined the processes, we then need to determine and apply the criteria and methods to measure the effectiveness of the processes. So how do we know these processes are performing the way we want them to? How do we know that they're effective? We have to apply some sort of criteria and method to measure those processes. And then we have to evaluate those processes and implement any changes needed when they're not achieving their intended results, right? We've got to make some improvements if we're not getting the results that we want to see from these processes. And so I want to bring up the clarification document that the International Aerospace Quality Group, IAQG, maintains. They've got a clarifications document that's a compiled list of questions and answers regarding specific clauses. It's a great source to utilize when you're unsure of the intent of any of the clauses. I've included a link here, which I know you're not gonna be able to physically click right now, but the IAQG website does have this resource available, so you can find it on the website. And the reason I bring this up is because the IAQG weighed in on the specific clauses that we're talking about here, 441 C and G. So let's take a look at what that question was and how it was answered by the IAQG and by their sector document representatives. So the question on this clause asks, is it the intent of the standard that an organization can have just a top-level requirement that is used to evaluate the effectiveness of the QMS and several individual processes without those processes having specific metrics? For example, on-time delivery of product to the customer of 98% is a top-level metric and the metric used to evaluate the effectiveness of the purchasing process, contract review process, and the manufacturing process with no additional metrics. So if they have met the on-time delivery of 98%, then all processes are deemed as effective. So in this scenario, this question is asking, if we have these processes here and we're just applying on-time delivery as the sole criteria to determine if all these processes are effective, does that meet the intent of the standard? And so the answer to this question is no. The 9100 series standard requires the organization to determine if the identified processes are effective and achieving planned results. Each process measure should evaluate the effectiveness of that process and be value added. This is the measure that would be included in process effectiveness assessment reports, PAIRs, which are a form that the auditors will complete in OASIS for each of your operational processes. So this measure that we're talking about here would be included in the process effectiveness reports as a key performance indicator for that process. The 91 series standard does not mandate a certain number of process measures. It goes on to say small organizations typically have fewer measures than larger organizations. These small organizations have increased visibility regarding process health due to their size. Regardless, this does not alleviate the need for determining if processes are effective and achieving planned results. The organization can have additional working level measures that may not flip to top management or management review. So what does that mean for your quality management system? As the answer indicates, using a top-level objective as an overall measure for all processes is not appropriate and does not meet the intent of 441C and G. As it says in that clarification, each process measure should evaluate the effectiveness of that process and be value added. So rather than having just a blanket KPI as on-time delivery in that example that measures all processes, the intent of the standard is to have something more specific to those processes, to really zero in on the activities that occur within those processes and give you a better idea about the effectiveness of those processes. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at some examples of measures that are more value added and provide a more precise measure of effectiveness for those three example processes that we have. And with that being said, I want to bring up another great resource that the IAQG has, which is called the Supply Chain Management Handbook. This was developed by subject matter experts to assist organizations with understanding requirements and how to apply them. Another great resource to have on hand. Specifically, the section of this supply chain management handbook we're focusing on is in 7.11.2. It includes a vast number of examples of value-added key performance indicators that you could apply to your processes if they're a good fit for you in your organization. So we've pulled some of these examples just to give you a better idea of what the standard is looking for in terms of key performance indicators for your specific operational processes. So again, we're kind of working with that example that was brought up in that question where we have contract review, purchasing, and manufacturing that we're going to look at here. Okay, so some of the examples here for the contract review process include things like quote turnaround time, measuring how many RFQs are answered with quotes sent to customer within a defined time frame, for example, 3 days, versus the total number of answered RFQs. So we're zeroing in on the activities within the contract review process. How effective is a quoting process? How many quotes are getting turned around and how fast? Order entry errors, measure of how many orders entered with errors first, how many total orders entered within a given time frame. Quarterly sales, measure of overall sales made in the quarter versus a defined sales goal for that quarter. Sales conversion rate, number of contracts awarded versus total number of contracts bid, and adherence to program gates, the measure of the number of program milestones successfully passed on time. So for these examples, they're really focusing on the common activities that happen in a contract review process and measuring how effective those specific activities are. Rather than just having a blanket KPI of on-time delivery, we're really zeroing in on the specific activities in the process to get a better idea of the health of that process and how effective it is. So continuing on to purchasing, we've got some more examples here that are tied to the purchasing process activities. starting with purchase order launch performance, the number of purchase orders sent on time versus the total number of purchase orders, purchase order acknowledgement rate, the number of purchase orders acknowledged by the supplier within the required due date versus total number of purchase orders sent, supply chain performance, the measure of overall on quality and on time performance of the supply base, supplier capacity rating, the measure of the supplier's capacity versus the capacity required by the product/program fulfillment as planned by the customer, and receiving inspection acceptance rate, the number of received materials or services that pass receiving inspection without incidents versus the total number of received materials and services. So these are just some examples of possible KPIs or key performance indicators that could more accurately measure the purchasing process versus an overall measurement of on-time delivery. And so the last example process here we have is a manufacturing process. So these are some more examples from that supply chain management handbook specific to the manufacturing process. Starting with scrap rate, which would be the number of items that were scrapped divided by the number of items produced during a time period, item escape rate from internal processes to internal customer, the number of items produced and identified by internal customers that were not compliant versus the total number of items produced, first pass yield, the rate of on-quality deliverables produced by process divided by the number of deliverables going into that process over a time period, inventory accuracy, a measure of accuracy of inventory by taking an actual count of items in stock, comparing it to what's recorded in the database, labor efficiency, the ratio between the amount of time planned for completing certain activities and the action time taken to complete those activities, and then on-time manufacturing, the number of items completed on time in the given time period versus the total number of items planned to be completed in that time period. So again, these are just a bit more specific to the actual activities within the process. So to summarize here, the point of 441 C&G is that establishing strong value-added process measures will allow you to have a higher level of visibility of the health of your processes. So if you have a KPI that's really specific to the activities in those processes, and you're continually monitoring that KPI and checking in to see how your process is performing, you'll have a better idea of the health of that process. And then if you do miss a KPI target, you can really zero in on the specific cause of the underperformance and take corrective action. This will lead to continual improvement of each process and in turn of your overall QMS. So that's our first topic here. Any questions on that? And if we don't get to them now, we'll definitely get to them at the end of the whole presentation. But if you have any questions now, please feel free to type them into the questions block. Okay, let's move on to our next topic here, which is about supplier performance monitoring in AS 9100, 9110, and 9120. This requirement is found in 8411 of the standard, specifically 8411C, which is highlighted or in blue here and underlined. So it says the organization shall periodically review external provider performance, including process, product, and service conformity and on-time delivery performance. So, as it states here in this requirement, you're required to periodically review your supplier's performance, including on-time delivery and quality. However, there has been some confusion on which suppliers need to be reviewed and how often they need to be reviewed. So again, I want to return to that clarifications document I mentioned from the IAQG, because there's another great question on a specific clause that clarifies these questions for us, right? So the question posed says, if the organization wishes to apply a risk management approach to suppliers, indicating varying levels of rigor for evaluation, approval, and reevaluation, dependent upon the effect on product conformity, is that acceptable? The answer says, clause 8411C requires a periodic review of external provider performance, including conformity and on-time delivery. So it is required that every supplier that affects product, process, or service conformity have a periodic review of this information. The organization can review this information at various frequencies, depending upon risk, but the information is still required to be reviewed. Without a periodic review of quality and on-time delivery, how would an organization apply a risk management approach? So it is pretty clear looking at this answer that the intent of this clause is that all suppliers that affect product quality are reviewed periodically for their performance of quality and on-time delivery. Now, based on this clarification, it is up to you as an organization to determine the frequency of the supplier performance review, and you can have varying frequencies for different suppliers tiers. So for example, if you prefer to review your top 10 suppliers more frequently, so let's say you review your top 10 suppliers every 6 months versus your other suppliers every 2 years or whatever it may be, it's up to you to determine that frequency. But all suppliers that affect product service quality must be periodically reviewed. So even if you purchase one component from one supplier every year, and that's all you purchase from them, if what they're providing to you affects product or service quality, they have to have their performance reviewed in addition to all your other suppliers. So wanted to bring this up because this is a common clause that has some misconceptions, and I'm hoping that helped clear it up. But if you have any questions on this area of the standard, please feel free to type those into the question section on your GoToWebinar. Okay, so next up, sorry, one moment here. We are going to be talking about organizational risk versus operational risk. So in the AS9100 and AS9110 standards, there are 2 clauses dedicated to risk management. We have 6.1 and 8.1.1. Now 8.1.1 is not applicable to AS9120, so if you're certified to AS9120, you don't have to worry about 8.1.1, but 6.1 still stands in 9120. These clauses require your organization to manage different kinds of risks: organizational risks for 6.1 and operational risks for 8.1.1. Now, sometimes these two can be confused for one another, so wanted to take a closer look at each of these clauses and then analyze some examples of risk management. Okay, so again, we're going back to the requirement in the standard for 6.1.1. This is the same requirement that's also in ISO 9001. But it says here that when planning for the quality management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1. Now, 4.1 talks about the internal and external issues of your organization, your context of your organization, and the requirements referred to in 4.2. And 4.2 talks about the interested parties of your organization. And so we're considering those issues and those interested parties and determining the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to A, give assurance that the QMS can achieve its intended results, B, enhance desirable effects, C, prevent or reduce undesired effects, and D, achieve improvement. It goes on to say the organization shall plan A, actions to address these risks and opportunities, and B, how to integrate and implement the actions into its QMS processes and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Actions taken to address risks and opportunities shall be proportionate to the potential impact on the conformity of products and services. And there's a couple notes here also regarding 6.1 of the standard. So to further give some more context here, we've pulled the definition from the ISO TS 9002 on 6.1.1. It says here that the intent of this subclause is to ensure that when planning the quality management system processes, the organization determines its risks and opportunities and plans actions to address them. Its purpose is to prevent nonconformities, including nonconforming outputs, and to determine opportunities that might enhance customer satisfaction or achieve an organization's quality objectives. When determining the risks and opportunities for the quality management system, the external and internal issues, as noted in 4.1 of the standard, as well as relevant interested party requirements in 4.2 should be considered. Examples of the risks that the quality management system will not achieve its objectives include the failure of processes, products, and services to meet the requirements, or the organization not achieving customer satisfaction. So really, when we're talking about 6.1, we're talking about the QMS as a whole, the big picture of your quality management system. And we're considering any internal issues, any external issues, any needs and requirements that are interested parties, all the things that influence the context of your organization, and any risks or opportunities that are associated with them. So some examples of some risks, some organizational risks that would apply to 6.1.1 that may be relevant to your organization. We've got some examples here. First one here is an aging workforce with multiple retirements approaching. So this would be something that's kind of an internal issue, right, of your organization that may be a possible risk that needs to be mitigated, things like that. Another example would be the effects of tariffs in certain industries on material costs. This is a potential external issue that could be a risk for your organization. Another external issue that could be a risk is cybersecurity risks, such as phishing, ransomware, malware. These are coming more and more common, unfortunately. But this could potentially be a risk that your organization needs to address. And then we have risks associated with extreme weather events, such as forest fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, et cetera, depending on your organization's region. These would be, again, examples of some external issues that could possibly qualify as risks that may be something your organization needs to mitigate. But again, these are all kind of big picture risks, right? They're looking at the entirety of your QMS and could influence the entirety of your QMS. So let's talk about the 811 risks. Oh, I'm sorry. First, we've got some risk management tools. So there are different tools and methodologies that an organization can adopt to help manage risks and identify opportunities. There's no specific methods that are required. These are all examples actually from the auditor guidance material that the IAQG has. And so they include things like learning from the past, lessons learned, PESTL, SWOT, FMEA. You might be familiar with some of these. And these are just some examples of how some organizations have addressed organizational risk within their organization. So let's look at the 811 requirement next. This is our operational risk management. And again, this is not applicable to 9120. It's just applicable to AS 9100 and AS 9110. So it says here, the organization shall plan, implement, and control a process for managing operational risks to the achievement of applicable requirements, which includes as appropriate to the organization and the products and services, A, assignment of responsibilities for operational risk management, B, definition of risk assessment criteria, examples, likelihood, consequence, risk acceptance, C, identification, assessment, and communication of risks throughout operations, and D, identification, implementation, and management of actions to mitigate risks that exceed the defined risk acceptance criteria, and E, acceptance of risks remaining after implementation of mitigating actions. And I wanted to highlight the note that they have here because it makes a clear distinction between these two clauses. It says, well, Clause 6.1 addresses the risks and opportunities when planning for the quality management system of the organization. The scope of this clause, 8.1.1, is limited to the risks associated to the operational processes needed for the provision of products and services in Clause 8. So again, it's making that distinction between the risks when planning for your quality management system as a whole, and the risks specifically associated with the operational processes, the provision of products and services. Now, 8.1.1 is a little more specific in what it requires. Like it says here, we need assignment of responsibilities for risk management, definition of risk criteria, identifying, assessing, and communicating risks throughout the organizations, how to manage risks that exceed the defined risk acceptance criteria, how to accept risks, things like that. It's a little more specific. But again, no specific methodology is required. So what are some examples of some operational risks that would be applicable to 8.1.1? Here we can work through these examples here. The first one here is customer's PO identifies a delivery date that will be challenging to meet with the current workload. So you've received a customer purchase order and has the delivery date there that will be difficult to meet due to all the other jobs that you have in process with their own delivery dates. This could be a potential operational risk. You might have to decide what you can do to mitigate that risk. The second example here is customer requires use of a vendor you have previously had issues with. So let's say you've accepted a contract from a customer. And you're looking through the requirements of the contract, or maybe you've done this before, you should have done this before you accepted the contract, but the contract would require use of vendor, let's say a heat treat provider that you have not had a great history with. They haven't been able to meet your delivery dates, there maybe been some quality issues, but in order to accept this contract, you have to work with that vendor. So there's a risk involved there. Whether you accept the contract, if you don't accept the contract, you might have to come up with a mitigation action to ensure that the work you do with that vendor is a little more positive this time, doesn't have any risks associated with it. Another example here, a new customer request for quote is for a large component that takes up more facility space than usual. So if you were to accept this request for quote, if you are going to quote this, that may mean that if the customer issues a purchase order and you accept it, you may have to move some things around your facility space in order to just allow for the sheer size of the component that you'll be making. Another last example here, Customer contract flows down specific requirements your organization has not yet implemented, such as specific requirements for a counterfeit parts prevention program or CMMC, or maybe they require AS9102 for first article. If you haven't yet implemented those requirements, there's a potential risk involved in there. So these are more specific. These risks are more specific to the operational processes, the realization of your production or your service provision. So this is what differs from those 6.1 risks that are related to your quality management system as a whole. So as shown, the standard differentiates between risks associated with planning for your QMS and risks specifically associated with provision of products and services. Having effective methods in place to identify and mitigate both types of risks will allow your system to reduce undesired effects and better achieve its intended results. So if you have any questions on this portion, please feel free to enter those in the chat now, and we can take a look at those at the end of the presentation. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. This is about control of non-conforming outputs and corrective action. So in the 9100 2016 series standards, there's 2 required procedures or processes that need to be defined and maintained as document information. We have the control of non-conforming outputs process in clause 8.7 and the non-conformity and corrective action process, which is in clause 10.2. Now, these processes do go hand in hand. These activities, I should say, do go hand in hand. And it is acceptable to include the requirements for both in a single procedure or document, or even your quality manual, wherever you want to document it. But you must ensure, whoever you document it, that those procedures address all aspects of both 8.7 and 10.2. So let's take a closer look at each of these clauses and what they require. Now, 8.7, control of non-conforming outputs, the intent of this clause is to prevent the unintended delivery or use of non-conforming outputs at all stages of production and service provision. There are different ways to deal with non-conforming outputs, and when you do have a non-conforming output and further action is needed, the requirements for corrective action should be then applied, which is when clause 10.2 steps in. But let's take a closer look at the actual requirement in the standard. And this is a long one, so let's get into it. It says the organization shall ensure that outputs that do not conform to the requirements are identified and controlled to prevent their unintended use or delivery. There's a note here that says non-conforming outputs includes non-conforming product or service generated internally, anything received from an external provider, or anything identified by a customer after shipment. The organization shall take appropriate action based on the nature of the nonconformity and its effect on the conformity of products and services. This shall be also applied to non-conforming products and services detected after delivery of products during or after the provision of services. Now, what we have in blue here is the procedural requirement, the requirement for this to be maintained as document information. So it says, the organization's non-conforming control process shall be maintained as document information, including the provisions for defining the responsibility and authority for the review and disposition of non-conforming outputs. So who's responsible and who has the authority to disposition non-conforming outputs. And you have to also document the process for approving persons making these decisions. Also need to include the provisions for taking actions necessary to contain the effect of the nonconformity on other processes, products, and services, timely reporting of nonconformities affecting delivered products and services to the customer and to relevant interested parties, and defining corrective actions for nonconforming products and services detected after delivery as appropriate to their impacts. So that's when 10.2 steps in. The clause goes on to state that organizations shall deal with nonconforming outputs in one or more of the following ways: correction, segregation, containment, return or suspension of provision of products and services, informing the customer, obtaining authorization for acceptance under concession by a relevant authority, and when applicable by the customer. Goes on to say dispositions of use as is or repair for the acceptance of non-conforming products shall only be implemented after approval by an authorized representative of the organization responsible for design or by persons having delegated authority from the design organization, and after authorization by the customer if the nonconformity results in departure from the contract requirements. Product disposition for scrap shall be conspicuously and permanently marked or positively controlled until physically rendered unusable, and counterfeit or suspect counterfeit parts shall be controlled to prevent re-entry into the supply chain. Conformity to the requirements shall be verified when non-conforming outputs are corrected. Then this 872 talks about what records you need to maintain regarding this process. And so it says the organization shall retain document information that A, describes the nonconformity, B, describes the actions taken, C, describes any concessions obtained, and D, identifies the authority deciding the action in respect of the nonconformity. So that was quite a lot, but I want to focus in here on the documentation requirements from this clause. So there needs to be a procedure or other means of maintaining document information. It doesn't necessarily have to be a procedure, but just needs to be documented in some way that defines your provisions for all these things. We went through this already, right? Then you also have to keep records that describe the non-conforming outputs, the actions taken to address them, and any concessions obtained from customers, relevant authorities, and who authorized the action be taken. So we have a procedural requirement and a record requirement here for the non-conforming outputs process. Now, I want to return to our clarifications document because there is a clarification on 8.7 that I thought was a good one to share. The question here asks, our organization makes parts from foam, plastics, and fiberglass, and as such, it is impossible to permanently mark the scrap. Scrap is normally the excess material from die cutting, water jet cutting, or routing. We had special bins made that had scrap/trash on the sides. These bins are emptied into a trash compactor as they fill up. Is putting this type of material in a marked bin adequate, or does each piece require marking? So here's the official answer from the IAQG. They said the intent of this requirement is to ensure no defective product re-enters the value stream, which is the purpose of having the requirement to physically render non-conforming product unusable. It is important to remember that clause 8.7 is for product that does not conform to product requirements. Therefore, if the materials are conforming and there is material excess from die cutting, water jet cutting, or routing operations or other splitting operations for distributors, your excess material does not fall within the scope of scrap control in 8.7 in this clause. If your product is non-conforming to product requirements, that is when the scrap provisions of clause 8.7 will be applicable. Once that material is dispositioned as scrap, it would need to be marked or positively controlled until it be rendered unusable. So it's distinguishing here from the scrap that is just excess material that happens during these processes like die cutting or water jet cutting or routing operations. That scrap that naturally occurs is not what they're referring to when they talk about scrap in 8.7. When they're talking about this product disposition for scrap shall be conspicuously and permanently marked or positively controlled into physically rendered unusable. That's when we have something that is non-conforming, that's been dispositioned as scrap, that's when that requirement steps in. But if we're just talking about material excess scrap, that's not applicable to this portion of the standard. So good clarification to share here, I thought. Okay, now we're going to talk about 10.2, the corrective action process. So 8.7 is talking about the control of non-conforming product and preventing it from, re-entering the value stream, whereas 10.2 is talking about managing nonconformities and implementing corrective actions appropriately. So when a nonconformity occurs, including those arising from identified nonconforming outputs, from complaints, problems arising from external providers, audit results, third-party audit results, the organization must take action to investigate what has gone wrong, correct it, and avoid similar issues from recurring. So here's the 10.2 requirement in the standard. It's another lengthy clause here, a couple clauses. So it says, when a nonconformity occurs, including any arising from complaints, the organization shall react to the nonconformity and, as applicable, take action to control and correct it and deal with the consequences. And then evaluate the need for action to eliminate the causes of the nonconformity in order that it does not recur or occur elsewhere by 1, reviewing and analyzing the nonconformity, 2, determining the causes of the nonconformity, including as applicable those related human factors, and we will touch base on human factors in a moment, determining if similar nonconformities exist or could potentially occur, then implement any action needed, review the effectiveness of any corrective actions taken, update risks and opportunities determined during planning if necessary, make changes to the QMS if necessary, flow down corrective action requirements to an external provider when it is determined that the external provider is responsible for the nonconformity, and lastly, take specific actions when timely and effective corrective actions are not achieved. And it says corrective actions shall be appropriate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. And then the organization shall maintain documented information that defines the nonconforming corrective action management processes. So that's where our procedural requirement comes in. We have to have something maintained as document information that defines the nonconforming corrective action management processes. So that defines all of your processes for these clauses here, 10.2.1a through H. Then our records requirement comes in at 10.2.2. It says the organization shall retain document information as evidence of the nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent actions taken and the results of any corrective action. So focusing on what documentation is required, your organization has to define the process for your nonconforming corrective action, addressing all items of 10.2.1, and this has to be maintained as document information, typically in the form of the procedure, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as long as it's documented in some way. You must also keep records as evidence of the nature of the nonconformities, what was the nonconforming condition, any subsequent actions taken. This includes any correction, any containment, root cause analysis, the corrective action, and the results of any corrective action. Were the corrective actions effective? Were they ineffective? How did you determine that? Is additional action needed? Were risks updated? So this means that all 10.2.1a through H needs to be recorded in some way, and we typically see this captured on a corrective action form. Now I wanted to share some more clarifications regarding 10.2 from that IAQG clarifications document. The first question here asks, some are interpreting this requirement that we are required to determine causes for every nonconformity we encounter, no matter how insignificant. 9100/2009 allowed us to define our requirements on when we would determine causes in our procedure. Realistically, I don't believe that any organization has the resources to determine causes for every nonconformity. And so the answer to this question was clause 10.2.1b starts with evaluate the need for action. So the first action is to determine if there is a need for action. If so, then the following actions in clause 10.2.1b would be required, including root cause analysis and corrective action. The organization establishes criteria for when taking actions, corrective actions are appropriate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. It is not wise to expend significant resources for isolated low-cost nonconformities. So basically, to sum this up, it says that when your organization encounters a nonconformity, you correct it, and then you determine, based on your defined process, if further action is needed. It may not be needed. At that point, then you would follow the actions described in 10.2.1b through H. The second one I want to share is, the second clarification I want to share is a question on 10.2.1b2, and it says, is it acceptable to just list human factor as the cause as stated in this requirement? And the answer says no. The intent of adding those related to human factors is to consider human factors in the causal analysis and not stop at human factor or workmanship. And I want to continue on with this discussion of human factors just because this is also something that gets kind of lost in the mix here. 10.2.1b2 requires that you must evaluate the need for action to eliminate the cause of the nonconformity by determining the causes of the nonconformity, including as applicable those related to human factors. So you must consider human factors when doing your causal analysis. The intent is not to stop at human factors. Now here's a list of the dirty dozen human factors. You may have seen this list around before, but I just wanted to put it here because it's some good context. When we're talking about human factors, we're talking about things like lack of communication, complacency, lack of knowledge, distractions, lack of teamwork, fatigue, lack of resources, pressure, lack of assertiveness, stress, lack of awareness, norms. And so let's say you have in your situation, a machinist may have machined a hole in the wrong place. And when doing your root cause analysis, you may determine that the operator or the machinist was distracted. Instead of just saying as your root cause distraction, we want to go a little bit further there. Why was the machinist distracted? What's missing in the process that can help prevent distraction? So we don't want to stop at distraction. We want to keep going and really dig into the true cause. But human factors should be considered. Okay, another clarification here that I thought was a good one to mention, clause 10.2.1e requires organizations to update risks and opportunities determined during planning if necessary. Does this need to be performed for every corrective action? And the answer here was the organization determines when update to risks and opportunities based upon corrective actions. This is the risk feedback loop where a possible escape from the risk process has occurred, and the organization determines if inclusion to risk and opportunity planning is required. So the intent here is not to update your risks and opportunities for every single corrective action, but just to consider if risks and opportunities need to be updated. So it doesn't need to happen for everyone, but it should be considered when you're doing your corrective action. Okay, so we've talked about 8.7, we've talked about 10.2, both pretty in depth. Let's talk about the difference between the two with an example. So in this example scenario that's completely made up, a machinist accidentally drops a part number 1234, while transporting finished goods to the quality control for inspection. QC determines that the part is damaged and no longer conforming. The part is tagged with a red non-conforming tag and placed in a bin for non-conforming parts to be dispositioned. QC then fills out a form for the non-conforming part, documenting the issue and authorizing rework to be completed by the machinist to bring the part back into conformance. This specific person who authorized this signs their initials on the form. No concessions were needed. The QC personnel who signed is listed in the control of non-conforming outputs procedure as someone who has been approved to disposition non-conforming parts. So this is an example of the control of non-conforming outputs process in action in compliance with 8.7. We have a non-conforming part. It's been reviewed and dispositioned by someone who has the authority to do so. It's been identified until it's been fully dispositioned. It's been, removed from the value stream, so it's not going to be re-entered into and, possibly shipped by accident. And so that's where the control of non-conforming outputs process lives, right? This is an example of that. Now, moving on to the corrective action process in this example, let's say in the same organization, all non-conforming output forms are reviewed and submitted to and reviewed by the quality manager. The quality manager reviews those forms to determine if additional action is needed. Let's say the QM tracks these non-conformities to see if there's any trends, and the quality manager sees that in the last few months, there have been several issues with parts being dropped. So due to this trend, he's determined that corrective action is necessary. Additional action is needed, and the corrective action process needs to step in. So he initiates a corrective action form. Now, what information needs to be recorded on that form based on the requirements of 10.2? Let's take a look at an example. So in this example scenario, we're going to kind of continue on with it. This is kind of some of the information that should be captured on the corrective action form. Now, when I go through this, I'm going to be talking about certain requirements, especially for correction, root cause, and corrective action, and how this relates to your third-party findings you might get from a third-party AS 100, 9120, 9110 audit by a CB. So we'll start with the top information. So let me actually go back to the requirements in 10.2.1. So everything here in 10.2.2 needs to be recorded on our corrective action form, right, as evidence of the corrective action process. We need to have the nature of the nonconformities, any subsequent actions taken, and the results of the corrective action. So when looking at our example here, we have the nature of the nonconformity captured at the top here. The process for transporting parts to QC for inspection is not currently effective. So that's the statement of nonconformity. It gives us an idea of what the broader issue is. The specific objective evidence talks about the specific nonconformity. It says here the machinist dropped part number 1234 when bringing the parts to QC. Containment is not needed in this situation, but we do need a correction. So it says here the dropped nonconforming part number 1234, was reworked and brought back into conformance. As we see here in this response, and this is something that is required for third-party corrective action responses, the correction here is written in past tense, and it's very specific about which part was reworked. It notes the specific part number. So it's clear as day that this has been corrected. The part was reworked and brought back into conformance, the specific part that was mentioned in the nonconformity. Then we have our root cause analysis here. It says the process of transporting parts by hand is not effective due to the susceptibility of human error. This can be addressed by utilizing carts, but personnel are not currently trained to use carts. This is due to the work instruction not requiring the use of carts. So in our root cause analysis, we're considering human factors, right? But we're not stopping there and just saying, yeah, people drop parts sometimes. Instead, it's saying, well, yes, this process is susceptible to human error right now, and it can be improved by utilizing carts. Why aren't people using carts? Because they're not trained to do so. Why aren't they trained to do so? Because the work instruction doesn't require it. So we're going as deep as we can go here. We're answering all these why questions until the logical end. And that's the same type of root cause analysis that should be done with some third-party findings at your AS 9100, 9120, 9110 third-party audits. And now, when we go to our corrective action, the root cause leads us right there. And that's the ideal situation, that we go so far in a root cause that there's a very logical answer in our corrective action. So the corrective action here states, purchased carts for the purpose of transporting parts. Applicable employees underwent training on the new process for transporting parts to QC and back. Training records are attached. The work instruction has also been revised to include clause stating that parts must be transported via cart, revised work instruction attached. So we've addressed all the causes from our root cause with very specific corrective actions to prevent the issue from recurring and to improve the process for transporting parts, improve the effectiveness of that process. There's also notes here on the verification, implemented the cart system on 10/1/24. On 10/31, no recurrences of dropped parts have been reported or observed. Interviewed employees reported that the process is effective. Corrective action has been verified and closed. And there's also a note here that says not needed at this time to update risks. So this example of a corrective action form really clearly addresses all those record requirements in 10.2.2, but it's just an example of how this could be documented. So the difference between the two, as we said, the prior slide here, the one that we just looked at, this is the corrective action process in action, right? In this example, a non-conforming output was the input for the corrective action process. Inputs can also come from customer complaints, audit findings, employee identified problems, external provider issues, performance data, etc. But in this example, we just saw where we had the control of non-conforming outputs process in action that led us to the corrective action process. But they're still kind of distinct processes. Okay, so as we discussed, the control of non-conforming outputs process and the corrective action process are related, but it is important that each process is fully realized in your QMS. As discussed, both 8.7 and 10.2 require a procedure or other means to document information. You just have to document those requirements in some way. And you can utilize a single document to address both clauses if you'd like, but you must ensure that all aspects of 8.7 and 10.2 are defined and documented. Overall, a robust control of non-conforming outputs process and corrective action process will lead to continually improving and effective AQMS. Okay, so that concludes our presentation here. I wanted to check and see if there are any questions on anything we discussed. So give me just a moment as I open up the question bar here. Okay. So for clause 8, we have a question that says, for clauses 8.1.1 and 6.1, when a risk is identified and mitigation is started, would a CODO log be the best place to document all data related to the risks, or would there be a better option? So a CODO log, we have seen that before as something that addresses 6.1 and 8.1.1. If that's the way your organization, it's best suited for organization, then that's fine. It's up to you as an organization to choose the best suited tool for you. As long as it addresses the requirements in 6.1 and 8.1.1, no specific method is required or is considered better than the other. Any other questions? I'll give it a moment here. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. But if you do have any additional questions, any questions on what we discussed, or anything that pops up in your head that you want some help with, or I can help point you to the right direction or try to get that answer for you. So please feel free to record my email address here. Keep it on hand if you ever have any issues that come up. You can also reach me by phone by calling PJR headquarters, 1-800-800-7910, and asking to speak to Kim Wagner. I'll be more than happy to help in any way I can. But thank you all for joining this morning. I really appreciate it. And please feel free to contact me at any time if you have any questions. Thank you.